The mahogany door to Harrison and Associates felt heavier than it should have as I pushed it open that Wednesday morning in November. The reception area smelled like fresh coffee and old money, all polished wood and leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Mike was already there, checking his Rolex and adjusting his charcoal suit like he was preparing for a business meeting rather than our father's will reading. Amanda sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, her designer heels tapping against the marble floor in that impatient rhythm I knew so well. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They looked like they belonged here, in this world of expensive lawyers and inherited wealth. I felt like an imposter in my black dress from Target, clutching a folder that contained secrets they couldn't even imagine. When Mike glanced up and saw me, that familiar condescending smile spread across his face. "There she is," he said, loud enough for the receptionist to hear. "Don't worry, Jess. I'm sure Dad remembered you in his will. Maybe he left you his old toolbox or something sentimental like that." Amanda snorted without looking up from her phone. "Or his fishing gear. You always liked those weekend trips to the cabin when we were kids." But I didn't flinch this time. Instead, I sat down across from them and placed my folder on the coffee table between us. The sound it made was soft, but somehow it felt like thunder in the quiet room. I looked directly at Mike, then at Amanda. "Are you both absolutely certain you want to make jokes about inheritance right now?" I asked quietly. "Because what I have in this folder might change how funny you think this situation really is." The smugness faltered on Mike's face for just a moment. Amanda finally looked up from her phone. They exchanged a glance, the kind siblings share when they think they know something you don't, but this time, I was the one with the secrets. Growing up as Jessica Miller in Portland should have been a dream. Our family lived in one of those beautiful Victorian houses in Laurelhurst, the kind with the wraparound porch and the perfectly manicured garden that made neighbors slow down when they walked their dogs past our house. My father, Robert Miller, had built Miller Construction and Development from nothing into one of Portland's most successful commercial development companies. We had money, reputation, and from the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. But inside that beautiful house, I learned early that love came with conditions, and apparently I never quite met them. Mike, being the oldest and only son, was groomed from childhood to take over the family business. Dad would take him to job sites on weekends, teaching him about blueprints and profit margins while I stayed home with Mom. Amanda, with her natural charm and marketing degree from University of Oregon, became Dad's pride and joy when she landed a high-paying job with a Seattle marketing firm right after graduation. Then there was me, 28 years old, still finishing my degree part-time at Mount Hood Community College while working at Powell's Books downtown. I told myself I was taking my time, exploring my options, but the truth was simpler and more painful. Every time I'd shown interest in the family business, Dad had somehow redirected the conversation. Every time I'd achieved something academically, it got overshadowed by Mike's latest business success or Amanda's newest promotion. The signs were always there, but I explained them away for decades. Like how family photos on the mantle seemed to feature the three of them prominently while I was either cropped out or standing slightly apart. How Dad would ruffle Mike's hair and hug Amanda when they visited, but give me these awkward side hugs that felt more like obligation than affection. How conversations about family heritage and Miller family values somehow always happened when I wasn't in the room. The worst part wasn't the obvious favoritism. It was the gaslighting that came with it. When I'd point out the differential treatment, Mom would sigh and say things like, "Jessica, you're being overly sensitive," or "You know your father loves you, he just shows it differently." Dad would claim he was trying not to put pressure on me or that he wanted me to find my own path. But Mike and Amanda's paths had been paved with gold while mine felt like I was bushwhacking through thorns. Our annual summer trips to the family cabin at Mount Hood were where the dynamics became most painfully obvious. Dad would spend hours with Mike, teaching him to fish, talking about business strategies, planning hunting trips for just the two of them. Amanda would sunbathe and read magazines while Mom braided her hair, and they gossiped about people from church. I became the designated helper, the one who cleaned up after meals, organized supplies, and made sure everyone else was comfortable. One particular summer when I was 16 stands out in my memory like a scar that never quite healed. We'd been at the cabin for a week, and I'd been watching Dad and Mike work on replacing some deck boards. I'd helped carry lumber, handed them tools, even made suggestions about the layout that Dad had implemented. At dinner that night, when Mom asked how the project was going, Dad smiled and said, "Mike's really got a natural instinct for this kind of work. He's going to make a fine contractor someday." No mention of my help, no acknowledgement that half the design improvements had been my ideas. Just Mike, basking in Dad's approval while I sat there feeling invisible. When I tried to speak up, Dad waved me off. "Jess, you helped carry some boards. Mike did the actual work." The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that it took my breath away. That night, lying in the small bedroom I shared with Amanda while she texted friends back home, I started to wonder if something was fundamentally wrong with me. Was I not smart enough, not interesting enough, not worthy of the same love and attention my siblings received so effortlessly? I began to shrink myself, to expect less, to be grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. The pattern continued through high school and college. Mike got a brand new truck for his 16th birthday. Amanda got a used but reliable Honda Accord. I got permission to use Mom's old minivan occasionally, with strict curfews and mileage restrictions. Mike's college tuition at Portland State was paid in full, plus generous spending money. Amanda got the same deal at University of Oregon. When it came time for my college applications, suddenly there were discussions about building character through financial responsibility and not wanting to spoil me like we might have spoiled the others. I took out student loans. I worked part-time jobs throughout college. I watched my siblings graduate debt-free and walk into career opportunities that Dad's business connections had helped arrange, while I struggled to balance work and studies. The message was clear: they were investments worth making, and I was an expense to be minimized. After college, the disparities became even more pronounced. Mike moved back home temporarily, while Dad helped him find his own place, eventually settling him in a beautiful condo downtown that Dad co-signed for. Amanda got help with her security deposit and first month's rent when she moved to Seattle, plus a generous emergency fund that she never seemed to need to use. When I finally saved enough to move out of the family
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Home into a small apartment near campus, I did it entirely on my own. Dad's only comment was, "Good for you, Jess. Independence builds character." The final insult came last year when Dad had his first heart attack. It was minor, just a warning, but it scared everyone enough to start having those difficult conversations about the future. One evening while he was recovering, I overheard him talking to Mike in the study. The door was slightly ajar, and their voices carried down the hallway where I was organizing some of Dad's medical paperwork. "Son, I want you to know that when the time comes, you'll be taking over the business completely," Dad said. "Your sister in Seattle is doing well for herself, and Jessica, well, she'll figure something out. She's always been more of a dreamer anyway. Not really cut out for the construction world." Mike's response made my stomach drop. "What about her share of the inheritance, though? I mean, she is family." Dad was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that haunts me still. "Mike, there are different kinds of family. There's the family you're born into, and there's the family you choose to invest in. Jessica's a good girl, but she's never really been Miller material. Not like you and your sister. I stood in that hallway, holding a stack of insurance papers, feeling like I'd been punched in the chest. Not Miller material. After 27 years of trying to earn my place in this family, my own father had just dismissed me as somehow fundamentally inadequate. That night, I cried myself to sleep in a way I hadn't since I was a child. But something else happened that night too. A small stubborn voice in the back of my mind started asking questions I'd never dared ask before. Why was I so different from my siblings? Why did I feel like a stranger in my own family? Why did Dad look at me sometimes like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve? Those questions started eating at me over the following months. I began paying attention to family stories differently, noticing gaps and inconsistencies I'd never caught before. Like how Mike and Amanda had detailed baby books with hospital bracelets and footprints, while mine seemed hastily assembled with fewer photos and generic milestone cards instead of specific documentation. How they both had Dad's strong jaw and Mom's green eyes, while I had brown eyes that came from nowhere we could trace, and a face that looked nothing like either parent. The questions multiplied when Dad had his fatal heart attack 3 months ago. The grief was real and devastating, but so was the relief I felt guilty about admitting. Relief that I wouldn't have to keep trying to earn love that was never going to come. Relief that the constant comparison and disappointment were finally over. And relief that maybe, finally, I could stop pretending to be something I apparently wasn't. The funeral was everything you'd expect for a successful businessman in Portland. Hundreds of people, flowers everywhere, a service at St. Matthew's that felt more like a business networking event than a goodbye. Mike gave a eulogy about Dad's legacy and vision. Amanda spoke about his generosity and family values. I was asked to read a psalm. At the reception afterward, I watched my siblings work the room like they were born to it. Mike discussing business transitions with Dad's partners, Amanda charming family friends with stories about his wisdom and humor. People approached me too, offering condolences, but the conversations felt different. More polite than personal, like I was a satellite member of the family, rather than a central part of it. Mrs. Peterson from next door pulled me aside at one point and said something that stuck with me. "Your father was so proud of Michael and Amanda," she said kindly. "And you know he loved you too, dear, even if you were always such a different sort of child. A different sort of child." Even the neighbors had noticed. That's when I started seriously considering the possibility that had been lurking in the back of my mind for years. What if I wasn't actually a Miller at all? What if there was a reason I'd never felt like I belonged? A reason that went deeper than personality differences or birth order dynamics? What if the truth was something none of us had ever talked about? The idea should have been devastating, but instead, it felt almost like hope. Because if I wasn't really Bob Miller's daughter, then his rejection of me wasn't about my inadequacy. It was about a truth that everyone had been too afraid or too ashamed to acknowledge. 2 weeks before the scheduled will reading, I made a decision that would change everything. I drove to a CVS pharmacy on the other side of town, bought an over-the-counter DNA testing kit, and swabbed my cheek in the parking lot. I paid extra for expedited results, because I needed to know before we sat down with the lawyer. I needed to understand who I really was before I found out what Bob Miller thought I was worth. The results came back via email on a Tuesday morning, while I was shelving books at Powell's. I read them on my phone in the biography section, surrounded by stories of other people's lives, while discovering the truth about my own. The words were clinical and clear, 0% probability of shared paternity with the reference sample I'd provided from Bob's coffee cup. I wasn't a Miller. After 28 years of trying to fit into this family, I finally understood why I never could. The relief was overwhelming, followed immediately by a white-hot anger that surprised me with its intensity. They knew. At some level they all knew, and they'd let me spend my entire life thinking there was something wrong with me instead of admitting there was something wrong with their story. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and drove to the Multnomah County Records office. If Bob Miller wasn't my father, then someone else was, and I was going to find out who. I spent hours going through birth certificates, marriage licenses and divorce records, looking for any clues about what had really happened in 1995. What I found was a marriage license for Linda Patterson and Robert Miller, dated 6 months before my birth date. But I also found something else, a divorce decree for Linda Patterson Thompson and David Thompson, finalized just 2 months before she married Bob. David Thompson. I stared at that name on the computer screen, my heart racing. My mother had been married to someone else right before she married Bob. Someone whose last name was Thompson, which meant nothing to me, but still felt significant somehow. I printed everything I could find, and drove home with a head full of questions and a folder full of potential answers. That night, I confronted Mom in the most gentle way I could manage. She was in the kitchen making dinner, humming to herself, looking smaller and more fragile than usual in the months since Dad's death. I sat down at the kitchen table, where I'd done homework for years, where we'd had countless family meals, where I'd never quite felt like I belonged. "Mom," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be honest with me." She looked up from the stove, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe. Or recognition. "What is it, sweetheart?" I pulled out the DNA test results and slid them across the table. "I need to know about David Thompson." The wooden spoon fell from her hand and clattered against the floor. She stared at the papers for a long moment, then slowly sank into the chair across from me. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears, but also something that looked almost like relief. "How did you find out?" she whispered. "Does it matter?" I asked. "What matters is that you've let me go my entire life thinking something was wrong with me, when the truth was that Bob wasn't my father." She was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "David and I were so young when we got married. He was working construction. I was barely 21. We thought we knew what we wanted, but we were both just kids playing house." I waited, not trusting myself to speak without screaming. "The marriage fell apart fast," she continued. "David was a good man, but he drank too much, and I was too immature to handle real problems. We separated when I found out I was pregnant with you. I filed for divorce because I thought it was over between us." "What happened?" I managed to ask. "I met your father, Bob, at a church function while David and I were separated. He was everything David wasn't. Stable, successful, mature. He knew about the pregnancy, knew about David, and he said he wanted to take care of both of us. He said we could be a real family." The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed made me sick. "So you married him while you were pregnant with another man's child?" "David was supposed to sign away his parental rights," she said quickly. "That was the plan. Bob was going to adopt you legally, and we were going to start fresh. But then David sobered up and said he wanted to be involved. He wanted custody. What did you do?" Mom's voice broke. "Bob hired a lawyer. We told David that if he didn't stay away, we'd make sure he never saw you at all. We had money and resources, and he was just a construction worker with a drinking problem. So he backed down." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not just that they'd lied to me, but that they'd kept me from my real father. That somewhere out there was a man who might have actually wanted me, who might have loved me the way Bob never could, and they'd threatened him into staying away. "Where is he now?" I asked. "I don't know," Mom said, but she couldn't meet my eyes. "Jessica, you have to understand. We thought we were protecting you. Bob tried to love you like his own, but it was complicated. Complicated, I repeated. Is that what you call 28 years of making me feel like I wasn't good enough? She reached across the table toward me, but I pulled my hands away. Sweetheart, Bob did love you. Maybe not the same way he loved Mike and Amanda, but he provided for you, he gave you a home. He gave me the bare minimum, I said, standing up. And now I understand why. I left her sitting at that kitchen table, crying into the DNA test results, and went up to my old bedroom to think. Everything made sense now. The distance, the favoritism, the constant feeling that I was auditioning for a role I'd never quite land. Bob had tried to love me, maybe, but I was a constant reminder of his wife's previous life, of the man she'd chosen before him, of a complication he'd never quite resolved. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just at Bob, but at Mom. She'd had choices. She could have told me the truth. She could have let me have a relationship with my real father. Instead, she'd chosen the easier path for herself, the one that kept her new marriage intact and her reputation unblemished, regardless of what it cost me. That night, I made another decision. I was going to find David Thompson, and I was going to learn the truth about who I really was. Not the Miller family's inadequate third child, but David Thompson's daughter. The daughter he'd been forced to give up. It took me 3 days of online searching to track him down. David Thompson, age 55, still working in construction as a foreman for a mid-sized company in Beaverton. Still in the Portland area, all these years later. I found his address, his phone number, even a LinkedIn profile with a photo that made my breath catch. He had my eyes. Not just the color, but the shape, the way they crinkled when he smiled. For the first time in my life, I was looking at someone who looked like me. I called him on a Thursday evening, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. When he answered, his voice was deep and kind, with a slight rasp that probably came from years of shouting over construction noise. "Mr. Thompson," I said, "my name is Jessica Miller. I think you might be my father." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then I heard him take a shaky breath. "Jessica," he said, and the way he said my name made me start crying. Like he'd been waiting 28 years to say it. "I never stopped thinking about you. Not once." We agreed to meet the next day at a coffee shop on Hawthorne, neutral territory where we could talk without interference. I got there early and sat in a corner booth, watching the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. When he walked in, I knew immediately it was him. Not just because of the eyes, but because of the way he moved, the way he scanned the room, the way his face lit up when he saw me. He was taller than I'd expected, with graying hair and hands that looked like they'd built things, fixed things, created things. He slid into the booth across from me, and just stared for a moment, like he was trying to memorize my face. "You're beautiful," he said finally, and his voice was thick with emotion. "You look just like your mother did when she was young, but you have my eyes." I showed him the DNA results, the birth certificates, everything I'd uncovered. He read through it all carefully, nodding, occasionally wiping his eyes. "They told me you'd be better off without me," he said when he finished reading. "Your mother's new husband had money, stability, could give you opportunities I never could. They said if I really loved you, I'd let you have a better life. Did you want me?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice. His face crumpled. "Want you? Jessica, losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I fought for you until they threatened to make sure I'd never see you at all. I was young and scared, and I didn't have the resources to fight a wealthy family with expensive lawyers." He pulled out his wallet and showed me a picture, worn soft from handling. It was me as a baby, maybe 6 months old, wearing a pink dress I didn't recognize. "Your mother gave me this before she married Bob. It's the only picture I have of you, and I've carried it every day for 28 years. That's when I completely broke down. This man, this stranger who was my father, had carried my picture for decades, while the man who raised me could barely manage genuine affection. David Thompson had been forced out of my life, but he'd never stopped loving me. Bob Miller had been given every opportunity to love me, and had chosen not to. We talked for hours that day. He told me about his family, about how he'd gotten sober after losing me, about the construction company he'd worked his way up in, about the small house he'd bought and maintained, hoping someday I might visit. He asked me about school, about my job at Powell's, about my dreams and interests. He listened like every word I said mattered, like he was trying to make up for 28 years of missed conversations. When we finally parted ways, he hugged me tight and said, "Jessica, I know I missed your whole childhood, and I can never make up for that. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be part of your life now." I drove home that evening feeling something I'd never felt before: chosen, not tolerated, not managed, not accommodated, chosen. David Thompson had fought for me until he couldn't fight anymore, and he'd never stopped wanting me in his life. Meanwhile, Bob Miller had treated me like an obligation he'd rather not deal with. The will reading was scheduled for the following Wednesday. I had 6 days to decide what to do with everything I'd learned. 6 days to figure out how to face Mike and Amanda and Mom, knowing what I now knew. 6 days to decide whether to drop this bomb before the lawyer read Bob's final decisions about my worth, or after. In the end, the choice was easy. If Bob Miller had decided I wasn't worth including in his will, I wanted my siblings to know exactly why. That said more about him than it said about me. I wanted them to understand that their father hadn't been the honorable family man they thought he was. And I wanted my mother to face the consequences of 28 years of lies. So I sat in that lawyer's office on Wednesday morning, watching Mike make jokes about toolboxes and fishing gear, and I felt nothing but calm certainty. They thought they were about to inherit a fortune and watch me get scraps. Instead, they were about to learn that their perfect family had been built on a foundation of lies, threats, and stolen love. The folder in my lap contained DNA tests, birth certificates, divorce records, and a letter from David Thompson confirming everything, but more than that, it contained the truth about who I really was.
Stomach clench. Here it came. The afterthought inheritance, the token gesture, the fishing gear Mike had joked about. I prepared myself for the disappointment, for the confirmation that even in death, Dad had seen me as less valuable than his other children. But what came next made the entire room go silent. I leave nothing. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mike's mouth actually fell open. Amanda blinked several times, like she was trying to process what she'd heard. Mom made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. "Nothing?" Mike said, his voice cracking slightly. "What do you mean, nothing?" Mr. Harrison held up a hand. "Please, let me finish reading." Robert was very specific about this. He cleared his throat and continued. "To Jessica Ann Miller, I leave nothing, because after 28 years of pretending otherwise, I can no longer maintain the fiction that she is my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear Amanda's shallow breathing, could hear Mike's leather chair creaking as he shifted uncomfortably. Mom had gone completely white, staring at the table like she could disappear into it. Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. "Jessica, I know this comes as a shock to you, and for that, I am sorry. But DNA testing that I conducted without your knowledge 2 years ago confirmed what I had suspected for most of your life. You are not my biological child, and while I tried to love you as if you were, I could never fully overcome the reminder of your mother's deception. I felt like I was watching this happen to someone else." The words were floating around me, but I couldn't quite grasp them. Dad had known. He'd known for 2 years that I wasn't his daughter, and he'd said nothing. He'd continued to let me try to earn his love, knowing it was impossible because I wasn't who I thought I was. "Your mother and I agreed when we married that we would raise you as my own, but the legal adoption was never completed due to complications with your biological father's rights. Therefore, you have no legal claim to my estate, and frankly, I believe it would be inappropriate for you to inherit wealth that should belong to my actual children." Amanda was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mike looked confused and angry, like someone had just told him the rules of a game had changed in the middle of playing it. Mom was crying quietly, her carefully applied makeup starting to run down her cheeks. "However, Mr. Harrison continued, Robert did want to ensure that you were not left completely without resources. He has arranged for a one-time payment of $10,000 to help you transition to independent living, along with the understanding that you are no longer considered part of the Miller family." $10,000. A severance package for 28 years of being the wrong daughter. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the sound that came out of my throat was something between a cough and a sob. Mike found his voice first. "This is insane. You can't just disinherit someone because of paternity. There are laws." Mr. Harrison nodded calmly. "Actually, since Jessica was never legally adopted, and Robert was never established as her legal father, she has no inheritance rights under Oregon law. Robert was very thorough in his research on this matter. But she's lived with us her whole life," Amanda said, her voice high and strained. "She's our sister." "Half-sister, technically," Mr. Harrison corrected. "And only through your mother's previous relationship," which brings me to the final portion of Robert's instructions. He pulled out another set of documents, these ones looking different from the will itself. Official, with multiple seals and signatures. Robert hired a private investigator 18 months ago to locate Jessica's biological father, David Thompson. Mr. Thompson has been informed of Jessica's existence and has expressed interest in establishing a relationship with his daughter. Robert felt this information should be shared at the time of his death, as he no longer felt obligated to maintain the secret that has shaped this family for nearly 3 decades. The room erupted. Mike started shouting about how this was impossible, how Dad would never have hidden something like this. Amanda was demanding to know if Mom had known all along. Mom was crying harder, trying to explain through her tears that it was complicated, that they'd thought it was better this way, that they'd been trying to protect everyone. But I just sat there, staring at Mr. Harrison, feeling something that was almost like relief washing over me. Dad had known. He'd known I wasn't his daughter, he'd known David Thompson was my real father, and he'd made the choice to exclude me anyway, but he'd also made the choice to give me the information I needed to find my real family. It was cruel and kind at the same time, which seemed perfectly in character for the man who'd spent my entire childhood maintaining just enough distance to remind me I didn't quite belong. "This is bullshit," Mike said, his careful composure finally cracking. "Dad wouldn't do this. He wouldn't just throw Jess away like garbage." I looked at my brother, my half-brother, and saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Genuine concern for me. For the first time in our lives, Mike Miller was angry on my behalf, and I didn't know how to process that. "Actually," I said quietly, and everyone turned to look at me. "He would," and he did. I pulled out my folder and set it on the table, but what Dad didn't know was that I'd already figured it out. Amanda's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" I opened the folder and pulled out the DNA test results I'd gotten weeks earlier. "I mean, I tested my own DNA against samples from Dad's coffee cup and Mom's hairbrush. I know exactly who my biological parents are, and I've already met my real father." Mom's face went from white to gray. Mike grabbed the DNA results and stared at them like they were written in a foreign language. Amanda just kept shaking her head. "You knew," Mom whispered. "You knew and you didn't say anything." "I wanted to see how this would play out," I said, pulling out more documents. "I wanted to see if the man who raised me had any love left for the daughter he'd discovered wasn't his. Apparently the answer is no." I slid David's letter across the table, the one he'd written to me after our coffee shop meeting. It was 3 pages long, handwritten, full of love and regret and hope for the future. It was everything Bob Miller's will wasn't. My real father has been looking for me for 28 years, I told my stunned family. He fought for custody when I was born, and you scared him away with lawyers and threats. He never stopped loving me, never stopped hoping he'd find me someday. And when I contacted him 3 weeks ago, he cried because he'd thought I was lost to him forever. Mike was reading David's letter, his face getting redder with each paragraph. Mom, is this true? Did you and Dad threaten this guy to keep him away from Jess? Mom couldn't speak, she just nodded, tears streaming down her face. Amanda grabbed the letter from Mike and read it herself, her expression shifting from confusion to horror to something that looked like guilt. Jessica, we didn't know. We were kids. We had no idea any of this was happening. I know, I said, and I meant it. Mike and Amanda had been children when these decisions were made. They'd grown up with the same lies I had, just from the privileged side of them. But now you do know. Now you know that the reason Dad always treated me differently wasn't because there was something wrong with me. It was because he could never let himself love someone else's child. That's not fair, Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad provided for you, he gave you a home, he paid for your education, he gave me the bare minimum, I corrected. He gave me exactly what he thought he owed to Linda Miller's inconvenient daughter. Nothing more, nothing less. I pulled out the last document in my folder, the one I'd been saving for this moment. It was a printout of an email exchange between Bob and his lawyer from 6 months before his death. I'd gotten it from the private investigator I'd hired to fill in the gaps of my story. Dad wrote to his lawyer about this inheritance decision, I said, sliding the papers across the table. He said, and I quote, "I've done my duty by Linda's daughter for long enough. It's time she learned to stand on her own 2 feet, preferably somewhere that doesn't remind me daily of my wife's poor choices." The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one was full of recognition, of pieces clicking into place, of uncomfortable truths that could no longer be ignored. Mike read the email twice, then handed it to Amanda without a word. When she finished reading, she set it down gently and looked at me with something that might have been respect. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I stood up, gathering my papers back into the folder. "I'm going to have dinner with my real father tonight. We're going to talk about what comes next, about building the relationship we should have had all along. I'm going to change my name from Miller to Thompson, because that's who I actually am, and I'm going to stop wasting energy trying to belong somewhere I was never truly wanted." Mom finally found her voice. "Jessica, please, can't we talk about this? Can't we work through it as a family?" I looked at her, this woman who'd raised me and lied to me and loved me in her limited way for almost 3 decades. "Mom, we're not family. We never really were. You've known that since before I was born, and you chose to build our entire relationship on that lie. I can't pretend anymore, and apparently, neither could Bob. But what about us?" Amanda said, and there were tears in her eyes now. "You're still our sister, half-sister, whatever. That has to count for something." It was the first time Amanda had ever claimed me as family without qualification, and it almost broke my resolve. Almost. But I thought about David Thompson, waiting at home for my call, probably worried about how this meeting had gone. I thought about the life I could have had if these people had been brave enough to tell the truth from the beginning. "Maybe it does count for something," I said, "but it doesn't count for enough to make up for 28 years of making me feel like I was lucky to be tolerated. You got the father who was proud of you, who invested in your futures, who saw you as his legacy. I got the father who counted the days until he could legally exclude me from his family." I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Mike. Amanda, you might want to ask Mom about the other secrets she's been keeping. Because if she lied about my paternity for 3 decades, what else do you think she might not have told you?" I left them sitting in that conference room, staring at each other across a table covered with legal documents and family secrets.
Let them sort through the wreckage of their perfect family story. I had somewhere better to be. David was waiting for me at a small Italian restaurant in southeast Portland, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and photos of the owner's family covering the walls. When he saw me walk in, his face lit up with genuine joy, the kind of expression I'd spent my whole life hoping to see from Bob Miller. "How did it go?" he asked, as I sat down across from him. I told him everything. About the will, about the DNA revelation, about Bob's final rejection and the family's shock. David listened without interrupting, his face cycling through anger and sadness and protective fury. "I'm so sorry, Jessica," he said when I finished. "You deserved so much better than that." "I know," I said, and for the first time in my life I actually believed it, but I also got something I never expected. "What's that?" I smiled at this man who shared my eyes, who'd carried my baby picture for 28 years, who'd never stopped fighting to find his way back to me. "I got my real father, and it turns out he's exactly the kind of man I always hoped he would be." David reached across the table and took my hand, and I felt something I'd been searching for my entire life. I felt chosen, not tolerated, not managed, not barely accepted. Chosen. "So what happens now?" he asked. I squeezed his hand and thought about the future stretching out ahead of me. A future where I didn't have to earn love, or prove my worth, or apologize for taking up space in my own life. "Now I get to find out who Jessica Thompson really is," I said, "and I think she's going to be amazing." Outside the restaurant, Portland glittered in the evening light, full of possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. For the first time in 28 years, I was exactly where I belonged. 2 days after the will reading, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Mike called 17 times before I finally answered, his voice strained and desperate in a way I'd never heard before. Amanda left voicemails that grew increasingly frantic, begging me to come home so we could talk things through as a family. Mom sent text messages that swung wildly between guilt-ridden apologies and defensive justifications for decisions she'd made before I was even born. I ignored most of them. I was staying at David's house in Beaverton, sleeping in the spare room he'd maintained for years without knowing why, surrounded by the life my real father had built, while hoping someday I might be part of it. The walls were covered with his construction projects, photos of buildings and houses he'd helped create with his own hands. It was so different from the Miller house, with its expensive furniture and professional family portraits, that never quite included me properly. David had taken time off work to help me process everything that had happened. We spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of 28 lost years. He told me about the jobs he'd taken after losing me, how he'd thrown himself into work to avoid thinking about the daughter he couldn't see. He'd gotten sober not through any program or intervention, but through sheer stubborn determination to become the kind of man who deserved to be my father if he ever got the chance. I kept thinking, he said over breakfast on Thursday morning, that maybe someday you'd come looking for me. I wanted to be ready. I wanted to be someone you could be proud of. It was such a foreign concept, a parent wanting to be worthy of their child's approval, that I almost didn't know how to respond. In the Miller house, love had always flowed upward. We children were expected to earn our parents' approval, to prove ourselves worthy of their investment and attention. The idea that David had spent decades trying to become someone I could respect turned everything I understood about family relationships upside down. On Friday afternoon, while David was at a job site, Amanda showed up at his front door. I watched through the kitchen window as she sat in her silver Lexus for 10 minutes, gathering courage or composure or both. When she finally knocked, I almost didn't answer. I wasn't ready for confrontation, wasn't prepared to defend my decision to walk away from the only family I'd ever known. But something in her posture when I opened the door made me step aside and let her in. She looked smaller somehow, less polished than usual. Her expensive clothes couldn't hide the fact that she'd been crying, and for the first time in our lives,
Amanda Miller looked genuinely vulnerable. Nice place, she said, glancing around David's modest living room, with its comfortable furniture and walls full of family photos that actually included me now. Very different from our house. It's not our house anymore, I said quietly. I'm not part of that family, remember? Your father made that very clear. Amanda flinched. Jessica, you can't really believe we knew about any of this. Mike and I were kids when these decisions were made. We had no idea Dad wasn't your biological father. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all I saw was exhaustion, and something that looked like genuine regret. Maybe you didn't know the specifics, I admitted, but you knew I was different. You knew I was treated differently, and you never once questioned why. She sank onto David's couch and buried her face in her hands. You're right, God, you're absolutely right, and I hate that you're right. We did know, maybe we didn't know the details, but we knew Dad loved us more than he loved you, and we just accepted it. We benefited from it. It was the first time in our lives that Amanda had acknowledged the inequality I'd lived with every day. The admission should have felt like vindication, but instead it just made me tired. Why are you here, Amanda? She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Because Mike found something. Something else Dad hid from all of us, including Mom. My stomach clenched. What kind of something? Amanda pulled out a manila folder, similar to the one I'd carried into the lawyer's office. Mike's been going through Dad's papers, trying to get the business transition sorted out. He found a safe deposit box that nobody knew about. The key was hidden in Dad's desk, and the bank records show he's been paying for it for over 20 years. She opened the folder and pulled out photocopies of documents that made my hands start shaking before I even finished reading them. Birth certificates, medical records, legal correspondence, but not about me. Amanda, what is this? It's about Mike, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike isn't Dad's biological son either. The papers fell from my hands and scattered across David's coffee table. I stared at Amanda, trying to process what she'd just told me. Mike, the golden child, the heir apparent, the son Bob Miller had groomed and cherished and built his legacy around, wasn't his biological child. That's impossible, I said. Mike looks exactly like Dad. He has his eyes, his jawline, his build. Amanda shook her head. That's what we always thought too. But look at this. She handed me a DNA test result, official and recent, dated just 3 months before Bob's death. Dad tested Mike without telling him, just like he tested you. The results came back negative for paternity. I read the document 3 times before the words sank in. Michael Robert Miller, 0% probability of shared paternity with Robert James Miller, just like my test results, but somehow more shocking, because Mike had been the chosen one, the favorite, the son who could do no wrong. There's more, Amanda said, pulling out additional papers. Dad hired the same private investigator to look into Mike's background. Turns out Mom had another relationship before she married Dad, someone she worked with at the insurance company, where she used to be a secretary. A man named Thomas Bradley. The name meant nothing to me, but Amanda continued. Thomas Bradley died in a car accident when Mike was 2 years old. Mom never told Dad that Mike might not be his biological son. She let Dad believe Mike was his from the day they got married. I sank into David's armchair, trying to wrap my head around this revelation. So Mom lied to Dad about both of us. It gets worse, Amanda said. According to the investigator's notes, Mom knew about her pregnancies with both you and Mike before she married Dad. She specifically targeted him because he was wealthy and stable, and desperately wanted a family. She saw him as a solution to her problems, not as a person she actually loved. The picture Amanda was painting was devastating. Linda Miller, the woman I'd called Mom for 28 years, hadn't been a young woman who made mistakes, and then tried to build a loving family. She'd been a calculating opportunist, who'd used deception and manipulation to secure financial security for herself and her children. Does Mike know? I asked. Amanda's face crumpled. I told him yesterday. He's not handling it well. That was an understatement that would have been funny under different circumstances. Mike Miller, the man who'd built his entire identity around being Bob Miller's son and heir, had just discovered that his whole life was built on the same lie as mine. What did he say? He said a lot of things, most of them not printable. He's angry at Dad for lying, angry at Mom for deceiving everyone, angry at the investigator for digging up the truth. But mostly he's angry at himself, for never questioning why Dad loved him so much more than he loved you. I felt an unexpected stab of sympathy for my half-brother. Mike had spent 32 years believing he was special, chosen, inherently valuable to Bob Miller. Learning that it had all been based on a lie had to be devastating. Amanda, why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I want you to come home. I want us to figure this out together, as a family, the real family, not the one built on Mom's lies. We're not a family, I said gently. We never were. We're just three people who happen to be raised in the same house, by the same deceptive mother. But we could be, Amanda insisted. Now that everything's out in the open, now that we all know the truth, we could actually be honest with each other. We could build something real. I looked at her sitting on David's couch, this woman who'd spent our entire childhood making me feel like an intruder in my own home, and I felt something I'd never expected. Pity. Not for the circumstances she found herself in, but for the fact that she still didn't understand the damage that had been done. Amanda, you got 26 years of believing you belonged somewhere, 26 years of being loved and cherished, and invested in. Mike got 32 years of being the chosen son, the heir, the pride and joy. I got 28 years of wondering what was wrong with me. But now we know it wasn't you, she said desperately. It was never about you not being good enough. It was about Dad being unable to love children who weren't his. Except you, I pointed out. You are his biological daughter, and he loved you completely, so it wasn't about paternity, it was about his relationship with Mom, and how he felt about the lies she told him. Amanda went quiet, processing this. When she spoke again, her voice was small and uncertain. So what happens now? Do we just pretend we never knew each other? Do we act like 28 years of living together meant nothing? I considered her question seriously. What did happen now? I'd found my real father, learned the truth about my identity, and walked away from a family that had never truly accepted me. But Mike and Amanda were still my half-siblings, still the people I'd grown up with, still part of my history, even if they weren't part of my future. I don't know, I admitted. I need time to figure out who I am outside of the Miller family dynamics. I need to build a relationship with David without the complication of trying to manage everyone else's feelings about it. What about Mom? Amanda asked. She's been calling you constantly. She's devastated about how everything came out. I felt a flash of anger that surprised me with its intensity. Mom is devastated about getting caught, not about the lies themselves. If Dad hadn't put everything in his will, if he hadn't forced the truth to come out, she would have been perfectly happy to keep lying to all of us for the rest of our lives. Amanda didn't argue with that assessment, which told me she'd probably reached the same conclusion herself. Mike wants to see you, she said instead. He's been asking about you constantly, since I told him about Thomas Bradley. I think he wants to apologize. The idea of Mike Miller apologizing to me was so foreign that I almost couldn't imagine it. Mike had never apologized for anything in his life, certainly not to me. He'd always been too secure in his position as the golden child to worry about how his actions affected anyone else. Tell Mike that I'm not ready to see him yet, maybe someday, but not now. I need space to process all of this without having to manage everyone else's emotional reactions. Amanda nodded, looking disappointed but not surprised. What about the money? Dad's $10,000 severance package. Are you going to take it? I'd been wondering about that myself. $10,000 was significant money to someone like me, someone who'd been working part-time jobs and taking out student loans for years. It could pay off my credit cards,
help me get established in a new apartment, maybe even allow me to quit Powell's and focus on finishing my degree. But it was also Bob Miller's final insult, his way of paying me off and washing his hands of any responsibility for the daughter he'd never wanted to claim. Taking it felt like accepting his version of my worth, like agreeing that 28 years of pretending to be family was worth exactly $10,000. I haven't decided, I told Amanda. Part of me wants to tell Mr. Harrison to donate it to charity, just to prove that I don't need Bob Miller's guilt money, but part of me thinks I've earned every penny of it and more. You have earned it, Amanda said quietly. You've earned a lot more than $10,000. You've earned an apology from all of us, and a family that actually wants you, and parents who tell you the truth. It was the most honest thing Amanda had ever said to me, and it almost broke down the walls I'd been building around my heart, almost. But I thought about David, probably finishing up his workday and looking forward to coming home to dinner with his daughter. I thought about the life I could build with someone who'd actually chosen me, who'd fought for me, who'd never stopped loving me even when he couldn't see me. Amanda, I need you to understand something, I said. I'm not angry at you and Mike for being Dad's favorite. You were kids, and kids can't help what parents they're born to. But I'm also not responsible for helping you process your guilt about it. You benefited from a system that excluded me, and now you get to figure out how to live with that knowledge. She nodded, tears starting to flow again. I know, I wish things had been different. So do I said. But they weren't, and we can't change the past. We can only decide how to move forward. Amanda gathered up the papers she'd brought, and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back one more time. Jessica, for what it's worth, I think Dad was an idiot. You turned out to be the strongest person in our family, and he was too blind to see it. After she left, I sat in David's living room, surrounded by the evidence of Linda Miller's decades of deception. 3 children, 2 fathers, and a woman who'd built an entire life on lies and manipulation. It should have felt like the end of the world, the collapse of everything I'd thought I knew about my family and my history. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new. When David came home that evening, I told him about Amanda's visit, and the revelations about Mike's paternity. He listened with the same careful attention he'd shown every day since I'd found him, asking questions that showed he understood not just the facts, but the emotional complexity of the situation. How do you feel about it? He asked when I finished explaining. Angry, I said without hesitation. Angry at Linda for lying to everyone. Angry at Bob, for treating me like I was disposable while lavishing love on another child who wasn't even his. Angry at myself, for spending so many years thinking there was something wrong with me. David nodded. Those are all reasonable things to be angry about. But also relieved. I continued. Relieved that I finally understand why I never fit. Relieved that I found you. Relieved that I don't have to keep trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it to me. And what about your siblings? How do you feel about them? I considered the question carefully. Mike and Amanda were victims of Linda's deceptions too, in their own way. They'd grown up believing in a family that didn't exist, trusting in love that was built on lies. But they'd also been the beneficiaries of those lies, the ones who'd gotten the good parts, while I got the scraps. I feel sorry for them, I said finally, and I hope they figure out how to build honest relationships with each other and with Linda. But I also know that's not my job anymore. I spent 28 years trying to fix a family that was broken from the beginning. I'm done. David reached over and took my hand. What do you want to do now? I looked around his house, this space that felt more like home after 5 days than the Miller house had felt in 28 years. I thought about the future stretching out ahead of me, full of possibilities I'd never dared to imagine when I was still trying
To squeeze myself into a family that didn't want me? I want to change my name legally, I said. I want to be Jessica Thompson, not Jessica Miller. I want to finish my degree, and maybe think about graduate school. I want to get to know my real father and build the relationship we should have had all along. David's eyes filled with tears. I would love that more than anything.
and I want to let Mike and Amanda figure out their own relationship with the truth. They're adults, they can handle their own emotional processing. I'm not responsible for managing their guilt or their grief or their anger at Linda. That sounds very healthy, David said. I squeezed his hand and smiled. I learned something important this week. I learned that the right people don't require you to earn their love. The right people choose you and keep choosing you, even when it's difficult, even when it's complicated, even when other people try to keep you apart. Like I chose you, David said softly. Like you chose me, I agreed. And like I'm choosing you now, outside, Portland sparkled in the evening light, full of possibilities and new beginnings. For the first time in 28 years, I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the life I'd always dreamed of having. The Miller family drama would continue without me. Linda would have to face the consequences of her decades of deception. Mike would have to figure out who he was without Bob Miller's approval to define him. Amanda would have to decide whether she could build genuine relationships on the ruins of manufactured ones, but those were their problems to solve. I had better things to do with my life than clean up other people's messes. The knock on David's door came at 7 in the morning on a Saturday, aggressive and insistent in a way that made my stomach drop. Through the front window, I could see Mike's black BMW parked askew in the driveway, like he'd been in too much of a hurry to care about proper parking. David was already at work, having left early for an emergency repair job at a construction site downtown, which meant I was alone to face whatever emotional storm my half-brother had brought to my doorstep. When I opened the door, Mike looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and there was something wild in his eyes that I'd never seen before. This was Mike Miller stripped of his polished confidence, raw and desperate in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever imagined possible. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, pushing past me into David's living room. Right now, I closed the door slowly, buying myself time to think. In all our years growing up together, Mike had never sought me out for anything more meaningful than borrowing lunch money, or asking me to cover for him when he broke curfew. The fact that he was here now, looking like his world had imploded, meant something significant had happened since Amanda's visit 2 days earlier. "Good morning to you too," I said, crossing my arms. "What's so urgent that it couldn't wait for a reasonable hour?" Mike spun around to face me, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "Mom's gone," he said. "She packed her bags last night and left. No note, no explanation, just gone." The words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever I'd been expecting Mike to say, it wasn't that. Linda Miller, for all her faults and deceptions, had never been the type to run away from problems. She was more likely to dig in her heels and fight, to manipulate and scheme until she found a way to come out on top. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean gone," Mike repeated, his voice cracking. "Amanda went to check on her yesterday afternoon and found the house empty. Closets cleaned out, jewelry box emptied, important documents missing. She left the keys on the kitchen counter and just disappeared." I sank onto David's couch, trying to process this information. "Did she leave anything? Any indication of where she went?" Mike shook his head. "Nothing. Amanda called her cell phone about 50 times, but it goes straight to voicemail. We tried calling her sister in California, but Aunt Rachel hasn't heard from her. It's like she just vanished into thin air." A terrible thought occurred to me. "Mike, how much access did she have to the estate money, to Dad's accounts?" His face went pale. "Oh God, I hadn't even thought about that." He pulled out his phone and started dialing frantically. "I need to call the bank, need to check if there's been any unusual activity." While Mike talked to someone at the bank, I tried to wrap my head around the implications of Linda's disappearance. She'd spent decades building and maintaining an elaborate web of lies, and now that everything had come crashing down, she'd apparently decided that running away was easier than facing the consequences. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl with a mixture of anger and grudging admiration. Linda Miller had played the long game better than any of us had realized. She'd married a wealthy man under false pretenses, let him raise 2 children who weren't his biological offspring, and positioned herself to inherit a substantial portion of his estate when he died. Now that her deceptions had been exposed, she was cutting her losses and starting over somewhere else. The account, Mike said, hanging up the phone with a look of sick realization. Mom had access to Dad's primary checking account as his widow. She withdrew $400,000 yesterday morning, just hours before she disappeared. $400,000. More than enough to start a new life anywhere in the world, to disappear completely if that's what she wanted to do. It was a devastating blow to the estate, but more than that, it was a final insult to the children she was abandoning. Jesus, I whispered. She really planned this out. Mike collapsed into David's armchair, his head in his hands. I keep thinking about everything she said after Dad died. All those tears, all that grief about losing her husband, all that talk about how we needed to stick together as a family. She was probably planning this the whole time. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Linda hadn't been devastated by Bob's death and the exposure of her lies. She'd been calculating her exit strategy, figuring out how much money she could take, and how quickly she could disappear before anyone thought to freeze the accounts. Mike, I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. Whatever complicated feelings I had about my half-brother, I wouldn't wish this kind of betrayal on anyone. This must be devastating. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. You know what the worst part is? I keep thinking about all the times she told us how much family meant to her, how she'd never abandon us, how we'd always have each other, and now she's just gone, like we never mattered at all. I felt a familiar stab of recognition. This was what I'd lived with for 28 years, the knowledge that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally were actually just tolerating you until something better came along. The difference was that Mike and Amanda had been protected from that reality until now, while I'd been living with it my entire life. Mike, can I ask you something? I said carefully. Why are you here? Why are you telling me this instead of just dealing with it with Amanda? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because you're the only one who understands what it feels like to be thrown away by the people who are supposed to love you. The admission hung between us like a bridge. I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Mike Miller, asking for my understanding, acknowledging that I'd experienced something he was only now beginning to comprehend. It was validating and heartbreaking at the same time. Mike, what do you want from me? I don't know, he said honestly. I guess I want to understand how you survived it, how you kept going, when you realized that the people raising you didn't really want you there. I considered his question seriously. How had I survived 28 years of feeling unwanted? How had I managed to keep trying, keep hoping, keep believing that someday I might earn the love that seemed to come so easily to my siblings? I survived it by lying to myself, I said finally. I convinced myself that if I just tried harder, if I was just good enough, if I just proved my worth somehow, things would change. It took me almost 3 decades to realize that the problem was never with me. Mike nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that a lot since Amanda told me about Thomas Bradley, about how Dad treated you differently, how we all just accepted it. I keep wondering if maybe I knew deep down that something wasn't right. What do you mean? I mean, maybe part of me always wondered why Dad loved me so much when he barely seemed to tolerate you. Maybe I knew it wasn't because I was more worthy of love, but I didn't want to examine it too closely because I was benefiting from it. It was the most honest thing Mike had ever said to me, and it forced me to confront my own complicated feelings about our relationship. I'd spent years resenting Mike for being Dad's favorite, but he'd been a child when those dynamics were established. He hadn't chosen to be preferred any more than I'd chosen to be excluded. Mike, you were a kid, I said. Kids don't question their parents' love, they just accept it as their due. You couldn't have known that Dad's treatment of us was based on lies, but I could have been kinder to you, he said. I could have stood up for you when Dad was dismissive, or when Amanda made those cutting remarks. I could have questioned why you were always the one left out. Yes, you could have. I agreed. But you didn't, and we can't change that now. The question is what you want to do moving forward. Mike looked around David's modest living room, taking in the photos on the walls, the comfortable furniture, the sense of genuine warmth that permeated the space. Is this what a real family feels like? He asked. Being wanted, being chosen, being loved without conditions. I think so, I said. I'm still figuring it out myself. We sat in silence for a while, two people who'd grown up in the same house but lived completely different childhoods, trying to understand how we'd ended up in this strange new reality. Mike, the golden child who'd discovered his whole identity was built on lies. Me, the rejected daughter who'd found her real father, and a love she'd never known was possible. I've been thinking about giving up my inheritance, Mike said suddenly. The business, the properties, all of it. I don't know if I can build my life on something Dad only gave me because he thought I was his son. The statement shocked me more than Linda's disappearance had. Mike Miller, walking away from millions of dollars, and the family business he'd been groomed to run his entire life. It seemed impossible. Mike, that's a huge decision. Are you sure you're thinking clearly right now? I've never thought more clearly in my life, he said. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my relationship with Dad, about my place in the family, it was all based on a lie. How do I move forward with an inheritance I only got because of fraud? I understood his dilemma more than he probably realized. I'd been grappling with similar questions about Bob's $10,000 severance payment. How do you accept anything from someone who rejected you, even if that rejection was based on false information? What would you do instead? I asked. I don't know yet. Maybe start my own business, something that's actually mine instead of something I inherited under false pretenses. Maybe travel. Figure out who Mike Bradley is instead of who Mike Miller was supposed to be. The fact that he was already thinking of himself as Mike Bradley instead of Mike Miller told me how profoundly this revelation had affected him. He was questioning everything about his identity, just like I had when I discovered David was my real father. And Amanda, what does she think about all this? Mike's expression darkened. Amanda thinks I'm having a breakdown. She keeps saying that Dad loved me regardless of biology, that the inheritance is mine fair and square because I'm the one who worked for the company and learned the business. She doesn't understand why I can't just accept what happened and move on. Maybe she's not wrong, I said carefully. Maybe Dad did love you, even after he found out about your paternity. The DNA test results were only dated 3 months before his death, which means he knew the truth for years but never changed his will. Mike shook his head, but he changed his treatment of you as soon as he found out you weren't his. He spent 2 years knowing you weren't his daughter, and getting colder and more distant. Why would his reaction to me be any different? It was a fair point, and one that made me reconsider my assumptions about Bob's motivations. Maybe his love for Mike had been more genuine, less conditional than his relationship with me had been, or maybe he'd just been better at hiding his disappointment. Mike, I can't tell you what to do about your inheritance. That's a decision you have to make for yourself. But I can tell you that walking away from everything won't necessarily make you feel better about the lies. What do you mean? I mean that the healing doesn't come from rejecting everything connected to the deception. It comes from building something true and genuine to replace what was false. For me, that meant finding David and learning what real unconditional love feels like. For you, maybe it means taking the inheritance and using it to build something honest and good. Mike considered this. Or maybe it means finding Thomas Bradley's family and learning about that side of my heritage. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. If Mike was going to rebuild his identity from the ground up, he'd want to know about his biological father's family, just like I'd wanted to know about David. Have you looked into that at all? Tried to find information about Thomas Bradley? A little, Mike admitted. He died young, but he had a brother who's still alive. Lives in Salem, works as a mechanic. I've been thinking about reaching out to him. You should, I said. You deserve to know where you really came from, just like I did. Mike smiled for the first time since he'd arrived at David's house. Would you come with me when I go to meet him? The request surprised me. Mike and I had never been allies, never been the kind of siblings who supported each other through difficult times. But maybe that could change. Maybe we could build a genuine relationship based on truth instead of the artificial family dynamics that had defined our childhood. Yeah, I said, I'd be willing to do that. And maybe afterward, you could introduce me to David. I'd like to meet the man who's actually been a father to you. The offer touched something deep in my chest. Mike, acknowledging David as my real father, wanting to include him in whatever relationship we might build going forward. It was more recognition and respect than I'd gotten from the Miller family in 28 years. I think David would like that, I said. He's been worried about me cutting ties with everyone from my old life. He'd probably be relieved to know that some relationships might be worth salvaging. Mike stood up to leave, looking more settled than he had when he'd arrived. Jessica, I know I can't undo 28 years of treating you like you didn't matter, but I want you to know that I see you now, really see you. And I'm sorry it took this long. I appreciate that, Mike. And I want you to know that finding out about Thomas Bradley doesn't change the fact that you had a real relationship with Dad, whatever its foundation was. You don't have to throw away everything good from your childhood just because some of it was built on lies. After Mike left, I sat in David's living room, thinking about the strange turns my life had taken in the past few weeks. A month ago, I'd been Jessica Miller, the overlooked daughter, trying desperately to earn her place in a family that barely tolerated her. Now I was Jessica Thompson, building a relationship with my real father, while navigating the complex aftermath of Linda Miller's web of deceptions. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Amanda, her voice tight with stress and exhaustion. Jessica, I don't know what Mike told you, but Mom's disappearance is more complicated than he realizes. What do you mean? I mean, I've been doing some digging, and I found things that suggest this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Mom's been planning this for months, maybe even years. What kind of things? Bank records showing regular cash withdrawals over the past year. A safety deposit box she opened 6 months ago that's now empty. A post office box she rented under her maiden name that she's been using to receive mail from financial institutions. The implications were staggering. Linda hadn't just run away in a panic after her lies were exposed. She'd been systematically preparing for this moment, moving money, securing documents, creating an escape route that she could activate when the time came. Amanda, this means she knew this day would come. She knew eventually the truth would surface, and she was ready. It means more than that, Amanda said grimly. It means she never intended to face the consequences of what she'd done. It means she was planning to abandon us from the moment Dad got sick. The betrayal was complete now, not just the lies about paternity, but the calculated abandonment of the children she'd raised. Linda Miller had been playing a long game that none of us had even realized was happening. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm going to hire a private investigator to track her down. I'm going to freeze every account I can find, and I'm going to make sure she faces consequences for what she's done to this family. I understood Amanda's anger, but I also recognized the futility of her quest. Linda Miller was gone, and chasing after her wasn't going to undo the damage she'd caused or restore the family she'd destroyed. Amanda, maybe it's better to let her go. Maybe trying to drag her back will just cause more pain for everyone. How can you say that? Amanda demanded. After everything she's done, everything she's cost all of us, how can you just want to let her walk away? Because I've learned that some battles aren't worth fighting, I said. Because I've learned that healing comes from building something new, not from punishing the people who hurt you. Amanda was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you're doing with David, building something new? Yes, I said, and it's the best thing I've ever done for myself. I envy you, she admitted, having a fresh start, a parent who actually wants you. I'm stuck trying to figure out what to do with an inheritance from a man who might not have loved any of us as much as we thought he did. You could start fresh too, I suggested. You could decide that your relationship with Dad was real regardless of his motivations. You could choose to build your life on what was genuine instead of what was false. Maybe, Amanda said, but she didn't sound convinced. Right now I just feel like everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. After we hung up, I realized that I felt something I hadn't expected to feel about my former family's implosion. Peace, not satisfaction or vindication, just a quiet sense that justice had been served in its own way. Linda Miller had built her life on deception and manipulation, and now she was reaping the consequences of those choices. Mike and Amanda were grappling with the same questions about identity and belonging that I'd wrestled with my entire life. But I was done wrestling. I'd found my answers, found my real father, found the love and acceptance I'd always craved. The Miller family drama would continue without me, and I was finally okay with that. When David came home that evening, I told him about Mike's visit and Amanda's phone call. He listened with the careful attention I'd come to expect from him, asking thoughtful questions and offering quiet support. How do you feel about all of it? He asked when I finished explaining. Grateful, I said without hesitation, grateful that I found you before Linda disappeared. Grateful that I got the truth before she could take that away too. Grateful that I have a real family now instead of a fake one. David smiled and pulled me into one of his warm, unconditional hugs. I'm grateful too, he said. Grateful that you found me. Grateful that we have a chance to build the relationship we should have had all along. Outside, Portland glittered in the evening light, full of possibilities and new beginnings. Somewhere out there, Linda Miller was starting over with stolen money and a new identity. Mike and Amanda were trying to make sense of a family that had never been what they thought it was. But I was exactly where I belonged, with exactly the right person, building exactly the life I'd always dreamed of having. For the first time in 28 years, I was completely, genuinely, unconditionally loved. And that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. 6 months later, I stood in the parking lot of a small auto repair shop in Salem, Oregon, watching Mike pace nervously beside his car. He'd traded in the black BMW for a modest Honda Accord, part of his ongoing effort to strip away everything that connected him to the Miller name and the inheritance he'd ultimately decided to refuse. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Gone was the polished confidence that had defined him for 32 years, replaced by something more genuine but also more uncertain. You sure about this? He asked for the third time in 10 minutes, his hands shaking slightly as he smoothed down his hair. What if he doesn't want to meet me? What if he thinks I'm just some stranger trying to profit off his dead brother's memory? I studied my half-brother's face, noting the nervous energy that reminded me of my own first meeting with David. The difference was that Mike had grown up believing he was loved and wanted, so this rejection he feared would be a new experience for him. For me, rejection had been such a constant companion that finding acceptance had felt like winning the lottery. Mike, Uncle Eddie agreed to meet you, I reminded him. David called him personally to vouch for you. He knows you're not looking for money, or trying to take advantage of anyone. He's curious about his nephew. The past 6 months had been a journey of discovery for both of us, though our paths had been very different. While I'd been settling into life as Jessica Thompson and building a real relationship with David, Mike had been systematically dismantling everything that had defined Mike Miller. He'd resigned from the family construction company, putting his shares into a trust that would benefit local trade schools. He'd sold the downtown condo and moved into a small apartment in southeast Portland. Most dramatically, he'd legally changed his name to Michael Bradley, honoring the father he'd never known. Amanda had reacted to these changes with a mixture of bewilderment and frustration. She'd kept her inheritance, telling anyone who would listen that she couldn't be held responsible for decisions made before her birth. She'd thrown herself into managing what remained of the estate after Linda's theft, pursuing legal action against their disappeared mother with a single-minded determination that bordered on obsession. She took $400,000 and 28 years of lies, Amanda had told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. I'm not going to let her just disappear without consequences. But consequences, I'd learned, didn't always come in the form of legal justice or recovered money. Sometimes consequences were having to live with the knowledge of who you really were and what you'd done. Linda Miller was somewhere in the world, probably under a new name, but she was still the woman who'd built her entire adult life on deception and manipulation. That had to be its own kind of prison. The door to Bradley's auto repair opened, and a man in his late 50s emerged, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. Eddie Bradley had the same broad shoulders and strong jawline as Mike, the same way of carrying himself that suggested competence and reliability. But where Mike had always been polished and corporate, Eddie looked like exactly what he was, a working man who'd built his life with his hands and his integrity. "You must be Michael," Eddie said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of years of cigarettes and coffee. "You look just like Tommy did at your age. Same eyes, same stubborn set to your jaw." Mike's face crumpled slightly at the casual mention of his biological father, the man he'd never known, but whose absence had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. Eddie noticed the reaction and his expression softened. "Come on inside," he said gently. "I've got coffee brewing and about 30 years' worth of stories to tell you about your dad." The interior of the auto repair shop was exactly what I'd expected, organized chaos, with tools and parts arranged in a system that probably made perfect sense to Eddie, but looked random to outsiders. He led us to a small office in the back, its walls covered with photos and certificates, and what looked like decades of accumulated memories. "This was Tommy's desk," Eddie said, patting a worn wooden surface covered with papers and coffee rings. "He worked here for about 5 years after high school, before he met your mother and got married. He was good with engines, had a natural touch for diagnosing problems that other mechanics couldn't figure out." Mike reached out tentatively to touch the desk, as if he could somehow connect with the father he'd never known through the furniture Thomas Bradley had used 35 years earlier. I watched him process this tangible connection to his biological heritage, understanding exactly how transformative it felt to discover pieces of yourself in someone else's history. "What was he like?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
Handling something sacred. Inside were photographs of a young man who looked remarkably like Mike, letters addressed to my son Michael that had never been mailed, and a set of precision tools that had been maintained with obvious care. "He wrote you a letter every year on your birthday," Eddie explained, pointing to a stack of sealed envelopes. "Never sent them, but he wrote them anyway. Said someday when you were old enough to understand, he'd give them all to you at once." Mike picked up the first letter, dated when he would have been 3 years old, and held it like it might disintegrate. "Can I read them?" "They're yours," Eddie said simply. "Everything in that box is yours. It's what your father would have wanted." While Mike carefully examined the contents of his unexpected inheritance, Eddie turned to me with curious eyes. "And you must be the young lady who's been helping Michael navigate all this family history." "Jessica Thompson," I said, offering my hand. "Mike's half-sister, though we only recently figured out the exact nature of our relationship." Eddie's eyebrows rose. "Thompson? Any relation to David Thompson who works construction over in Beaverton?" "He's my father," I said, smiling at the recognition. "Do you know him?" "Know him? Hell, David and Tommy were best friends back in the day. They worked construction together before Tommy started here at the shop. David was the best man at Tommy's wedding to your mother." The revelation hit both Mike and me like a physical blow. Our biological fathers had been friends. David had known Thomas Bradley, had been part of his life during the brief period when he'd been married to Linda.
The web of connections was more complex than any of us had realized. David never mentioned knowing Thomas, I said, trying to process this new information. Might not have put it together, Eddie suggested. Tommy went by his middle name back then, called himself Tommy Joe instead of Thomas. And your mother was Linda Patterson when they got married, not Linda Miller. David might not have realized the connection. Mike looked up from the letters he'd been examining. This means our fathers knew each other. They were friends. More than friends, Eddie said. They were like brothers. David was the one who drove Tommy to the hospital when you were born. He was the one who tried to talk sense into him when the drinking got bad, and he was the one who held Tommy when he cried about losing you. The room went quiet as we absorbed the implications of this revelation. David had known my half-brother's father, had been present for Mike's birth, had witnessed firsthand the pain that Thomas Bradley had endured when he was forced to give up his son. It explained so much about David's determination to find me, his refusal to give up hope that someday we might be reunited. I need to call David, I said, pulling out my phone. He needs to know about this connection. David answered on the second ring, his voice warm with the genuine pleasure he still showed every time I called him. Jessica, sweetheart, how's the meeting going? David, I need to ask you something and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Did you know a man named Tommy Joe Bradley about 30 years ago? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought we might have lost the connection. When David finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Tommy Joe, Jesus, I haven't heard that name in decades. How do you know about Tommy Joe? Because Thomas Bradley was Mike's biological father, the half-brother I told you about, the one who found out he wasn't Bob Miller's son? His real father was your friend Tommy Joe. David's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Mike is Tommy's boy? The baby that Linda took away from him? Yes, and we're sitting here with Tommy's brother Eddie, learning about the father Mike never got to know. Eddie Bradley, David said, and I could hear him choking up. Is Eddie still running that auto shop in Salem? Still fixing cars and breaking hearts? I handed the phone to Eddie, who took it with hands that were suddenly shaking. David Thompson, you old son of a bitch, it's been too long. What followed was a conversation between old friends who hadn't spoken in decades, full of shared memories and catching up and the kind of easy familiarity that spoke of deep, lasting bonds. Mike and I listened to Eddie's side of the conversation, learning about our father's friendship through casual references to shared experiences and inside jokes. When Eddie finally handed the phone back to me, David's voice was thick with tears. Jessica, honey, I need to drive up there. I need to see Eddie, and I need to meet Mike properly. Tommy's boy. God, I can't believe it. We'll wait for you, I said. This is something we should all experience together. While we waited for David to make the drive from Beaverton to Salem, Eddie regaled us with stories about our father's friendship. They'd worked construction together, played poker on weekends, double-dated when they were young and single. David had been the steady one, the voice of reason, while Tommy had been the charmer, the dreamer, the one who always believed things would work out even when evidence suggested otherwise. Your father was the one who convinced Tommy to get sober the first time, Eddie told Mike. Said a baby deserved better than a drunk for a father. Tommy stayed clean for 6 months, longest stretch of his adult life. David was so proud of him. What happened? Mike asked. The legal battle wore him down. Every court appearance, every setback, every time some lawyer in an expensive suit told him he wasn't good enough to raise his own son. David tried to keep him focused, tried to remind him what he was fighting for, but eventually Tommy just gave up. The story was heartbreaking in its inevitability. 2 young men from working-class backgrounds going up against a system designed to favor wealth and status, trying to fight for a child who was being used as a pawn in adults' games. It was a battle they were never going to win, but they'd fought it anyway because that's what love required. When David finally arrived at the auto shop, the reunion between him and Eddie was emotional enough to make both Mike and me tear up. These two men who'd shared so much history, who'd been separated by grief and circumstance and the passage of time, embracing like the brothers they'd once been. "You look good, you old bastard," Eddie said, stepping back to examine David with obvious affection. "Life's been treating you well, it has been especially lately," David said, putting his arm around my shoulders. "Finding Jessica has been the best thing that's happened to me in 30 years. Then David turned to Mike, and I watched my real father study my half-brother's face with wonder and recognition. "My God, you look just like him. Same eyes, same smile. Tommy would have been so proud of the man you've become." Mike broke down completely then, sobbing into David's shoulder while this man who'd been his father's best friend held him and whispered reassurances. It was the kind of unconditional acceptance that Mike had never received from Bob Miller, the validation from someone who'd actually known and loved Thomas Bradley. "He talked about you constantly," David told Mike when the tears finally subsided. "Every day, he'd tell me something new he was planning to teach you when he got you back. How to throw a curveball, how to change oil in a car, how to treat people with respect even when they didn't deserve it. He loved you so much, Michael. Never doubt that." We spent the rest of the afternoon in that auto shop, 3 people connected by blood, and 1 connected by love, sharing stories and filling in gaps, and creating new memories to replace the ones that had been stolen. Eddie showed us photos of Tommy and David in their younger days, pictures of 2 friends who'd faced the world together with optimism and determination. Mike read some of his father's unsent letters aloud, sharing Thomas Bradley's hopes and dreams for the son he'd been forced to give up. The letters were full of love and regret, and determination to be worthy of fatherhood if he ever got another chance. "I'm going to be sober for you," one letter read. "I'm going to build a life that you can be proud of. I'm going to become the father you deserve, even if it takes me the rest of my life." David wiped his eyes as Mike read, remembering his friend's struggles and heartbreak. "He tried so hard," David said quietly. "Right up until the end, he was trying to become someone worthy of being your father." As the afternoon wound down, Eddie made an offer that surprised all of us. "Michael, I know this is sudden, but I'd like to teach you about cars. About the business, about the skills your father had. You don't have to work here permanently, but if you want to learn the trade that Tommy loved, I'd be honored to show you." Mike looked at this man who shared his DNA, this uncle who was offering him a connection to the father he'd lost, and nodded through fresh tears. "I'd like that very much. And Jessica," Eddie continued, "your family too, as far as I'm concerned. Tommy would have loved you like his own daughter, just like David does. You're both welcome here anytime." The drive back to Portland was quiet, both Mike and I lost in our own thoughts about the day's revelations. David had offered to give Mike a ride back to the city, and I could see them bonding in the rearview mirror, sharing stories and building the kind of relationship that should have existed between their children all along. "It's strange," Mike said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. 6 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. Now I'm discovering that everything I believed was wrong, but somehow I feel more grounded than I ever have." "That's what truth does," I said. "Even when it's painful, even when it destroys everything you thought you knew, it gives you something solid to build on." "Do you think Tommy and David would be proud of us?" Mike asked, "the way we've handled all of this?" David caught my eye in the rearview mirror and smiled. "I think they'd be amazed by the strength you've both shown. I think they'd be proud that you found each other and chose to build something honest instead of staying trapped in Linda's lies." 6 months later, I stood in the backyard of the house David and I had bought together in southeast Portland, watching Mike teach Eddie's grandson how to change a spark plug. Mike had been working at Bradley's Auto Repair for almost a year now, learning the trade that his father had loved, and finding peace in work that connected him to his biological heritage. Amanda was there too, along with her new boyfriend, a teacher she'd met at a grief counseling group. She'd finally stopped pursuing Linda through the legal system, accepting that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some people weren't worth chasing. She'd used her inheritance to start a foundation that provided college scholarships for children from single-parent homes, turning her privilege into something that actually helped others. I think about her sometimes. Amanda had told me at our last coffee meeting, "Wonder if she's happy wherever she ended up, if she ever thinks about the children she abandoned." "Probably not," I'd replied honestly. People like Linda don't usually develop consciences just because they escape consequences. But Linda Miller's choices had led to something she'd never intended, a real family built on truth instead of lies, love instead of manipulation, choice instead of obligation. Mike had found his biological heritage and a meaningful career. Amanda had found purpose in helping others and peace in accepting what she couldn't control. I had found David and the unconditional love I'd spent 28 years searching for. The house David and I shared was everything the Miller house had never been: warm, welcoming, filled with genuine laughter and honest conversation. The walls were covered with photos that actually included everyone who mattered, and the dinner table was a place where people came together because they wanted to be there, not because they had to perform family unity for appearances. "Jessica," David called from the kitchen where he was preparing dinner, "can you come help me with this?" I smiled and walked toward the voice of the man who'd chosen me every day for over a year now, who'd never made me feel like I had to earn his love or prove my worth. Behind me, Mike was showing Eddie's grandson how to properly clean a wrench, passing down skills and knowledge the way fathers had been doing for generations. The Miller family had been built on deception and had collapsed under the weight of its own lies. But from the wreckage, we'd built something better, a chosen family based on truth, acceptance, and genuine love. It had taken 28 years, but I'd finally found where I belonged. And that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. 3 years have passed since that November morning in Mr. Harrison's office, and I'm standing in the courthouse steps in downtown Portland, holding the final divorce decree that officially dissolves the last legal ties between Linda Patterson Miller and the family she abandoned. Amanda had finally tracked her down in Phoenix, Arizona, living under the name Linda Collins and working as a real estate agent. The legal proceedings had taken 18 months, but in the end Linda had agreed to the divorce and asset recovery settlement, rather than face criminal fraud charges. The recovered money, nearly $200,000 of the $400,000 she'd stolen, would be distributed according to Bob's original will. Mike had donated his portion to a scholarship fund for children of construction workers. Amanda had added hers to her existing foundation. I had declined my share entirely, asking instead that it be used to create a support group for children who'd discovered late in life that their parentage wasn't what they'd believed. The irony wasn't lost on me that Linda's final gift to our fractured family was teaching us the value of choosing how to use unearned money for something meaningful. She'd taken wealth built on lies, and we'd transformed it into something that might help other people navigate the kind of truth-telling that had reshaped our lives. "How does it feel?" Amanda asked as we walked down the courthouse steps together. She'd driven up from Eugene, where she'd relocated after selling the Laurelhurst house, and starting fresh in a city that held no memories of manufactured family dynamics. "Like closure," I said honestly. "Like the last chapter of a book I never wanted to read in the first place." Amanda nodded. She'd cut her hair short and stopped wearing the expensive clothes that had once defined her image. The change suited her, made her look more authentic and less like she was performing a role someone else had written for her. "Mike's waiting at the restaurant," she said, checking her phone. "He says he has news to share." We met Mike at a small Vietnamese place in the Alberta district, the kind of unpretentious establishment that had become his preference since leaving behind the polished world of high-end business dining. He looked healthy and content in a way I'd never seen during his Miller construction days, his hands bearing the honest calluses of someone who worked with tools instead of just paperwork. "I proposed to Sarah last night," he announced without preamble, his face breaking into the kind of genuine smile I'd never seen when he was Mike Miller. "She said yes." Sarah was Eddie's bookkeeper, a woman Mike had met 6 months after he started working at the auto shop. She was practical and kind and completely unimpressed by the wealth and status Mike had walked away from. Their relationship was built on the foundation of who Mike actually was, not who his inheritance had made him appear to be. That's wonderful, I said, meaning it completely. When's the wedding? Next spring, probably April. We want to do it at the shop, keep it small and simple, family and close friends only. He paused, looking directly at me. I hope you and David will be there. Sarah's been wanting to meet the sister who helped me figure out who I really was. The word sister still caught me off guard sometimes, the way Mike and Amanda had both started using it without qualification or hesitation. For 3 decades, I'd been the half-sister, the step-sister, the girl who lived in their house but wasn't quite family. Now they claimed me with a certainty that felt both validating and surreal. We'll be there, I promised. David's been wanting to meet Sarah too. He says anyone who can make you this happy must be pretty special. Amanda raised her water glass in a toast, to Mike and Sarah, and to building families based on choice instead of obligation. We clinked glasses, 3 people who'd survived the implosion of one family and were slowly carefully building something better from the pieces. It wasn't the same as growing up with unconditional love and honest communication, but it was something we'd created together, and that made it valuable in its own way. After lunch, I drove to David's office to share the news about the legal settlement and Mike's engagement. He was working late on a project proposal, reading blueprints by the light of his desk lamp in a way that reminded me how much I'd come to love watching him work. There was something meditative about the way he approached problems, methodical and patient and thoroughly competent. How did it go at the courthouse? He asked, looking up from the plans he'd been studying. It's finally over, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Linda signed everything, the settlement is final, and we can all move on with our lives. David smiled, and reached across the desk to take my hand. How do you feel about it? Relieved, grateful, ready to focus on the future instead of constantly processing the past. I squeezed his fingers, still amazed after 3 years by how natural it felt to be loved by this man. Mike proposed to Sarah. About time, David said with a chuckle. Eddie's been placing bets on when that boy would work up the nerve to ask her. We'd become a extended family of sorts, David and Eddie and me and Mike, connected by shared history and genuine affection. Eddie had become the father figure Mike had never had, while David had stepped naturally into the role of the dad I'd always needed. The 4 of us had dinner together most Sundays, sharing stories and planning projects, and creating the kind of ongoing relationships that felt both new and ancient. There's something else, David said, his tone shifting to something more serious. Something I've been wanting to discuss with you. My stomach clenched automatically, a response trained by decades of conversations that had started with similar words and ended with disappointment or rejection. But David's face showed only love and excitement, the expression I'd learned to associate with good news rather than bad. What is it? He pulled a small velvet box from his desk drawer and set it on the blueprints between us. I know we've talked about marriage being just a piece of paper, and I know you have complicated feelings about family and legal commitments, but I want you to know that I choose you every day, and I want to keep choosing you for the rest of my life. The ring was simple and beautiful, exactly what I would have picked if I'd been shopping for myself. Not the ostentatious display piece that would have impressed people at Miller Construction Company events, but something that spoke to who I actually was rather than who I was supposed to be. David, I whispered, hardly daring to believe this was happening. You don't have to answer right away, he said quickly, and you don't have to say yes just because I'm asking. But I wanted you to know that you're the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I'd be honored to be your husband if you'll have me. I looked at this man who'd spent 3 years proving every day that love didn't have to be earned or qualified or conditional, who'd never made me feel like I was lucky to be tolerated, who'd never compared me unfavorably to anyone else, who'd chosen me not because I was convenient or useful, but because he genuinely wanted me in his life. Yes, I said, not needing time to think about it. Yes, absolutely yes. The engagement ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for my hand. David came around the desk to kiss me, and I felt that same sense of belonging I'd experienced the first day I'd walked into his house, and realized what it felt like to be genuinely wanted. When, I asked. Whenever you want, he said. Tomorrow, next year, whenever feels right to you. I thought about the last 3 years, how much healing and growth and discovery had happened since that November morning, when Bob Miller's will had blown up everything I thought I knew about my family. I thought about Mike finding his biological heritage and meaningful work. I thought about Amanda creating something positive from her inherited privilege. I thought about Linda, wherever she was, probably still running from the consequences of her choices. I want Mike to walk me down the aisle, I said suddenly. And I want Amanda to be my maid of honor. I want Eddie to officiate if he's willing. I want our chosen family to be part of creating this new beginning. David's eyes filled with tears. I think that sounds perfect. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday afternoon in April, I stood in the backyard of Eddie's house in Salem, wearing a simple white dress and surrounded by people who'd chosen to love me. Mike, handsome in his new suit and beaming with pride, had just finished walking me to where David waited under an arch of spring flowers. Amanda, elegant in a blue dress that brought out her eyes, stood beside me holding my bouquet. Eddie, who'd gotten ordained online specifically for this occasion, cleared his throat and began the ceremony with words he'd written himself. We're gathered here today, not because of tradition or obligation, but because Jessica and David have chosen each other, and we've all chosen to support that choice. In the small crowd of guests, I could see Sarah sitting next to a woman I'd never met, someone Eddie had introduced as Tommy Bradley's sister from Seattle. She'd driven down for the wedding because, as she'd told me earlier, Tommy would have wanted family to be here for his best friend's daughter. The ceremony was brief and personal, focused on the promises David and I were making to each other, rather than the formal requirements of legal marriage. When Eddie pronounced us husband and wife, the cheer that went up from our small gathering was enthusiastic and genuine, the sound of people who were truly happy for our happiness. During the reception, Mike pulled me aside for a private conversation. I have something for you, he said, handing me a small wrapped package. It's from Dad, the real one. Inside was a letter in Thomas Bradley's handwriting, one of the unsent birthday messages he'd written during the years he was fighting for custody of Mike. But this one was different from the others I'd read. This one was addressed to the daughter my best friend will find someday. He wrote it after David told him about losing you, Mike explained. He never knew your name or when David would find you, but he wanted you to know that Tommy Bradley would have been proud to call you family. I opened the letter with shaking hands, reading words from a man I'd never met but who'd loved my father enough to write to a daughter he'd never know. To David's girl, whoever you are, wherever you are, I want you to know that your dad is the best man I've ever known. He talks about you every day, loves you every day, and never stops believing that someday you'll find your way back to each other. When that day comes, and I believe it will, remember that love doesn't depend on blood or law, or what other people think is right. Love is choice, and David chose you from the moment you were born. That makes you the luckiest kid in the world, even if it doesn't feel like it right now. I was crying by the time I finished reading, overwhelmed by this message from the past, this validation from a man who'd understood what I was going through even though he'd never met me. Mike put his arm around my shoulders, and for a moment we just stood there, two people who'd been shaped by fathers they'd lost and found again in different ways. He was right, Mike said quietly. We are the luckiest kids in the world. We just had to learn what luck actually looks like. As the afternoon turned to evening, and the celebration continued around us, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd been Jessica Miller, the unwanted daughter trying desperately to earn love that was never going to come. Tonight, I was Jessica Thompson, surrounded by people who'd chosen me, married to a man who saw my worth, part of a family built on truth and mutual respect. The Miller family fortune had been built on lies and manipulation, but it had led to something Linda could never have imagined: genuine relationships based on choice, rather than obligation, love rather than convenience, truth rather than performance. Sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property or status. Sometimes it's the courage to walk away from what's fake and build something real. Sometimes it's the wisdom to recognize that family isn't about DNA, or legal documents, or social expectations. Sometimes the best inheritance is learning that you're worth choosing, and having the strength to surround yourself with people who agree. David spun me around the small dance floor Eddie had created in his backyard, and I looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the Oregon sky. Somewhere out there, Linda was probably still running from the truth. Bob Miller was gone, taking his conditional love and impossible standards with him. But here, surrounded by chosen family and genuine affection, I'd found everything I'd been searching for without even knowing it. I'd inherited something more valuable than money: the knowledge that I was lovable exactly as I was, and the family to prove it every single day. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.